Well, good morning or good afternoon, and welcome everybody to another Monday edition of Genealogy Talk, I guess, if we want to call it something. Today's topic is going to be a little lighter than our normal topics. It's going to be a more fun kind of topic and not really very heavy as far as methodology or resources or anything like that. It's just a kind of a fascinating topic. And it's one that comes up an awful lot in the field of genealogy. This is something that I encounter all the time. So whether I am volunteering somewhere or lecturing somewhere or interacting with people on Facebook in genealogy groups, whatever I'm doing, I always encounter family stories. So that's something that I think all of us that do family history can relate to our family stories. For a lot of us, that's what brings us into our genealogy interest is a story that we've heard for our whole lives, and we want to find out the truth behind that story. We want to know if it's actually accurate or if it's something that's been completely made up. And so it's something that seems to play a big part in most people's family history journey are these different stories. So the point of this whole presentation is to examine some of those more common stories and to think about ways that we can get around the stories. How can we figure out if they're true or not? What should we be cautious about when we're hearing family stories? The one thing we don't want to be guided by is we don't want to be guided by mythology. So if we're hearing family stories and we're thinking that they're true, we don't want to give them too much weight until we've had a chance to check them out and to make sure that they're actually accurate. There are plenty of people out there who will, even when presented with the facts, will still believe the stories over the facts. So you definitely want to make sure that you're not going to be one of those people, that you're going to use actual backed up facts to guide your family history. So that being said, we're going to talk first of all about a few family stories and some of the more common ones. I think sometimes people buy into these family stories, of course, because they're things that they've heard from a very young age, and they've heard them repeated by the elders in their family. And, of course, they're taking these things as gospel. And one of the things that they may not realize are these stories are repeated by many different families. And I hear them all the time and very commonly. So when someone tells me a story about their great uncle or their great aunt that was a stowaway on a ship, I think, well, I just heard that story last week from someone different. So these stories tend to be extremely common and they tend to be repeated. So it almost makes you think, I wonder if whoever the relative is that is telling the story actually got it from somewhere else and figured it sounded like a good family story. So anyway, that's kind of the premise of this whole presentation, is to look at some of these family stories a little bit more closely. So this quote from Solomon Rushdie is actually very accurate. Family stories are very important. They're important for families, whether they're, mostly we want them to be true. But they also serve a purpose. Yes, today.
Sorry, Lisa. We're not seeing your PowerPoint.
Oh, it says I'm screen sharing.
We're seeing.
I'm going to go out.
Okay.
And I'm going to try it again. Okay. Now I'm going to try it again. Any better or no?
Yes, good now.
Great. Good. Okay. All right. Well, you didn't miss much. So this is all right. So we're going to start with a quote from Solomon Rushdie. And he is talking about, in this quote, about the importance of family stories. Now, family stories serve more purpose than just maybe giving us some information about our family history. They have a lot more purposes than just that. And he touches on that a little bit in this quote. He says, stories in families are colossally important. Every family has stories, some funny, some proud, some embarrassing, some shameful. Knowing them is proof of belonging to the family. So it's like when you know the family story, you're in a very exclusive club of people that have that knowledge and of people that share a common knowledge. So family stories are not only important for the facts about a family, but they also serve a purpose sociologically when it comes to family. There we go. So some of the importances and some of the things that are important about family stories. They link us to a shared identity. So you know the story, your sister knows the story, your first cousin knows the story, your aunts and uncles know the story. So this makes you a part of this particular family dynamic. They join you to a group of people who have a common history. So that makes that family bond all the more strong. They teach us life lessons. So a lot of the times our stories that we hear are based on the hardships that a family has faced. Perhaps maybe grandma and grandpa worked, 3 jobs to be able to support the family. These types of stories are showing us the resilience and the strengths that our ancestors had, and shows us that we want to follow their example. We want to be resilient. We want to be strong. So we want to use their stories to inspire us to be that way. Another thing that they do is they help us to understand our native culture. Now, for those of us who are several generations removed from our immigrant ancestors, maybe all we really have is some vague idea of what their life was like when they lived in a different country. Well, sometimes these stories can help us to understand what their life was like and some of the things and experiences that they had in that different country. So they help connect us to a native culture, a native heritage that we have no firsthand knowledge of. So that helps us in that regard. And they also provide us with role models. I can remember in my own particular case, I remember a lot of people telling me that I was a lot like a great aunt of mine. They said, you're so much like June. You have the same kind of personality as she does. And that makes you look at that person in your family history as a role model. Maybe this person did something important. Maybe they did something that kept the family from drifting apart. Maybe they were always the keeper of the family traditions. So those people are our role models, and those are the people that we look up to. And how do we get our role models but through family stories? Even if these people that you're hearing about are people that you've never actually met, you know that you're related to them and you know that they are part of your family narrative. So family stories do play a very important role in family history. So one of the things and the characteristics with family stories is they get passed down from generation to generation. So if there's a story that's being told about, for example, your family's immigration experience, that might be something that's passed down from your grandmother to your mother to you, or the story may possibly go even further back. What happens is this story becomes a little bit like the childhood game of telephone. You start at one end and you yell through the can, and the person on the other end hears you. But maybe they don't hear exactly what you're saying. Maybe they just hear part of it. So a little bit of it gets garbled. And so the person who's the receiver of the information has to interpret what they heard. And that is really what happens with family stories. They start somewhere far back in time and they get repeated. And then the next person to repeat the story maybe embellishes a little bit or leaves some parts out, or doesn't really quite understand what the whole thing was. So their version gets passed down. So by the time the story has been passed down from generation to generation to generation, you are probably not hearing what the actual story really was. You're hearing a version of that story. A lot of times our family stories don't have an identified origin. They're just kind of a fuzzy sort of, well, my grandmother used to tell me. And they don't have a specific person that they originate with, or a specific time period, or a specific document, or even really a specific documented incident. They are just kind of fuzzy and in a tradition. Generally, they tend to be oral, which means they're told verbally. They're not written down. So again, with oral history, that's subject to a lot of changes as those stories are told. Unless someone sits there and takes down verbatim what someone is saying, then the story can be altered slightly with each different teller. And then, of course, as we go through time, these narratives change. People hear what they want to hear. People hear only parts of the story. People interpret things. And so they use that interpretation and they pass that story down to the next generation. So there's a lot of room for variation in stories. There's a lot of room for things to be changed as the generations go on. So from wherever our story originated, we're generally quite a bit further in time from where it started. So you can see that there's a lot of opportunity for things to be changed as we go along. So the unfortunate portion of this is that a lot of family stories are based on fiction and not fact. And even if they are based on fact, a lot of that fact has been obscured through time. So there may be a fuzzy story about a family coming from Ireland and, a person stowing away on a ship, but no one can give dates, no one can give places, no one can sometimes even tell which ancestor that particular story has to do with. So that's where the family historian comes in. They want to try to either prove or disprove these family stories to see if there's a basis of fact that they may have come from. So now we're going to go through some of the more common family stories. And again, this is kind of funny. This is lighthearted. This is sort of a fun little thing just for you to realize the kinds of things that get repeated over and over and over again. Okay, number one, my great-grandmother was a Cherokee princess, or our ancestors were Native American. This is probably one of the biggest myths that people, especially in the United States, think about their family. A lot of this has really come up in the light of people getting DNA tests done and then finding to their dismay that they have no Native American DNA. And so they're kind of wondering, well, we've been told this our whole lives. How come we don't have Native American DNA? And that goes to, well, maybe it's either so far back that it's immeasurable, or maybe it just was never true to begin with. I think that in our country, there's a sort of romanticism about Native American people. And a lot of people feel that maybe their colonial ancestors, when they were here, they may have reproduced with Native Americans. And as a part of the family legend, people kind of want that to be true because it shows deep roots in this country. It shows that your ancestors were here when the Native American population was very large. But it's not always true. So just to be aware that this is something that is very often repeated, but very hard to prove, and often not even possible to prove. I think in 25 years of doing genealogy and in probably 15 years of volunteering, helping people, I've only ever once encountered someone that had a Native American ancestor that they were able to prove through a paper trail. And I probably hear that someone is related to Native American people probably 7 or 8 times a year. So it is a reality that most people are not descended from Native Americans, just so you know that. So number 2, our family name was changed to Ellis Island. This is another very common myth that I hear all the time. People's names changed all the time, and we know this. We know that this happened, and it's very well documented. But where the name changed is the important part of this story. There were no names changed by officials at Ellis Island or at any other immigration port. The reality was that when our ancestors boarded a ship in their native country, their name was taken down on the list where they got on the boat. And the name that was put on the list is the same name that was on their ticket, the ticket that they were given to get on the boat. So those names were taken from those tickets. How the names got on those tickets is another matter entirely. But those names on those tickets were recorded on the passenger lists. Then when the passengers arrived in the United States, whether they arrived in New York at Ellis Island or they arrived in Boston, wherever they arrived, those names were checked against the passengers. So the names on the list were checked against the passengers. And then they were allowed to go on their way or whatever happened to them. If your ancestor got off of Ellis Island and got into New York City and decided that he was going to change his very ethnic sounding name to something like Smith or Jones, that was entirely his prerogative. And it absolutely 100% was done. But it was usually done by the individuals themselves or by someone who employed them or by a relative, those were usually the people that changed the names. So the names were not changed at Ellis Island. So that's an absolute 100% that did not happen, but it is a very often repeated myth. And I hear that several times a year as well. So another one that we see often is we have a family crest, or we're descended from nobility. Now, we don't see a lot of that in this country because we're in America. We don't have a history of kings and queens here. So we're not generally tend to think we're descended from nobility. Tends to be a little bit more common in places like the UK, where they still do have a queen. But in our case, we usually don't see that very much. However, we do see a lot of people who have Irish origins or Scottish origins or English origins who feel that because their name is such and such, they have a family crest. Well, the truth of the matter is that family crests, as you see them, similar to this one for the no credibility family, are created for tourists. They are created to give people something to buy, to hang on their wall, and I'm completely guilty of doing that because I have one on my wall because they're pretty and they look nice. But the truth is that crests were granted to individuals. They were not granted to families. So if a person in the Middle Ages or later on did something that was especially commendable and the king or queen decided they were worthy of it, then that person was awarded a crest. The crest was not hereditary, so it did not pass down through families. So if you do find these crests, just know that they're fun, they're great to have, they look nice on genealogy reports, but they really don't have any meaning as far as families go. So that's just another thing to think about when we're thinking about family crests or being descended from nobility. A lot of times you will see full family charts of people that think they're descended from nobility. And, you know, if you can prove it, fine, but most people cannot. Another story is the three brothers story. You hear this often, and for some reason, it's always three. There's never 4 or 5. It's always 3. 3 brothers came to America. One went north, one went south, and one went west. They lost touch and never saw each other again. Now, this as a myth is kind of more maybe just an inaccuracy more than a myth. The fact of chain migration is absolutely a true thing. So it's very rare, and I do a lot of Irish research, so I find that it's very rare, especially in an Irish experience, for a person to just come to the United States by themselves and have no other ties to family or friends here. That doesn't happen very often. Most of the time, if people are coming here on their own, they're usually coming here to be with another family member or to be with a friend or a community member. So they are coming here as a part of a larger group. So the 3 brothers coming to America story is fairly plausible. And yes, they did go different places and they did lose touch. But just to be aware of the fact that the 3 brothers story is kind of an often repeated story. Sometimes they did go separate ways and sometimes they did lose touch, but that doesn't mean that they're not traceable, that just because you don't know what happened to them, maybe your ancestors did, but there is almost always something in that story that can be proved if it's possible, if it has some truth to it. So if you're looking at a situation where you think you have 3 siblings that came together or came and went in different directions, then there's almost always something you can do to prove or disprove that. And generally it would be to prove it, because if you did not find anything, then that would be disproof of it right there. So this is one of those myths that could be investigated and could be figured out. So another very popular story is my ancestor was a stowaway on a ship or was a fugitive. Now, my mother-in-law was very fond of telling of the fugitive story. She used to say that her grandfather was forced out of England because he owed somebody money, and so he was really in trouble. And I find that this is a lot of people's situation. Maybe this story sounds a little bit more interesting than just the plain The family was so poor and they had no opportunity in the land where they lived. And so they came here and wanted to do better. So it just sounds a little bit better if they were a stowaway or if they were a fugitive. Again, this is a story that could be proven or disproven. If your ancestor, came from a certain place during a certain time, it's possible to look through records to find out if there's any kind of evidence for being a fugitive or something like that. Obviously, if your ancestor went to Australia and you can prove that they were a convict, then you've got some information there. But a lot of times these types of questions can be answered by simply doing research. So that's a possibility there, but it is a very, very popular story. Another story that is sort of just not more like a myth, but more the reflection of not having a lot of experience with genealogy, is that the person that says that their family name has always been spelled the same. Well, it could very well be possible that you and your family members have always spelled your name the same. But that doesn't mean that people doing the recording of your name, people saying your name, people having your name go on to different documents, those people may not be spelling the name the same. The point of the matter is that you need to be aware of multiple spellings, lots of variations, all of these different things, just in order to do proper genealogy work. So in order to be able to research your family effectively, you've got to accept the fact that your surname is going to be spelled multiple different ways. And that isn't really a function of deliberate misspelling. It's more a function of the person who is doing the recording of the information, the person's educational level on both sides, your ancestor's educational level, the clerk's educational level, not to mention the fact that spelling doesn't tend to be standardized until about the mid 20th century. So prior to that, spellings were not really something that was taken that very seriously. As long as it was in the ballpark and there was a decent idea of what the spelling was, then that tends to be acceptable. So we look at spellings with 21st century eyes, and that is everything needs to be exact and to line up. So in order to think more like a genealogist, you have to be open to possibilities of many, many different spellings. So we need to get rid of that myth right off the bat. All people with the same surname are related. Okay, so this is another thing that tends to be a fairly common myth. Okay, so my last name is Walsh, so I must be related to every other Walsh on the planet. Well, this goes back to the origins of surnames. Now, years and many thousands of years ago, people on Earth didn't have two names. They usually only had one. Surnames started to come in, I guess, around the Middle Ages, from what I understand. But prior to that, people were just identified by one name. And then when surnames came in, they have lots of different origins. So for example, the name Smith generally refers to an occupation. So someone who was a blacksmith or a silversmith may have taken the surname Smith because that described what he did for a living. Also, the surname Cooper, that's another example of a occupational related surname. But as we come into more modern history, we do also still see people selecting their surnames and not necessarily using their family surnames. You find that actually now with people with their hyphenated surnames. Sometimes their children will have the name of their mother and their father. That's an example of someone choosing the name that they're using. So surnames do not always have the father to son to son to son tradition. They sometimes spring up out of other areas. It's not uncommon to find immigrant families, people that came from other countries, using different surnames. Sometimes a family will use their surname that they came to this country with in one area of the country, but a branch of the family that's moved to a different area of the country may find that it's easier to get along using a different surname. So therefore, they've changed their surname. So we need to think about the origins of surnames before we make a determination that everyone with the same surname is related. Can you use that as the basis, as a hypothesis for figuring out information about your family? Certainly. If you have a fairly uncommon surname and you're finding quite a few people with that surname in a particular location, then you can use that as a theory that maybe all these people are related. And then you would go in and you would try to prove it or disprove it. So there are some uses and benefits to making that assumption, but again, it's something that always has to be proven or disproven. So another great myth, the courthouse burned and all our family records were lost. This is a myth that everyone's heard. And whenever I hear this from somebody, I always try to say, well, have you verified that? Do you know that for certain? Sometimes it's used as an excuse by people who have the records but don't want to go out into the basement or up into the dusty attic to dig them out. Sometimes they'll be like, well, no, all of those records were burned. And it's a convenient excuse because people believe it. So there are, of course, certain instances where particular record sets were burned. A great example of that is the 1890 United States Census was almost completely destroyed by fire. So that is a fact. But if you are looking for records of a certain county, you need to do your research first to make sure that those records are there and that they were not a casualty of a fire. Because that way, if you hear it from someone, then you can say, well, I don't see any evidence that there was a fire. Could you show me the evidence that there was? So that may help you to get the records that you need. So don't just always assume because someone said there was a fire that there really was a fire. And also the other thing that's important to realize about these fire stories is that, do you know for a fact that the record you're looking for was involved in that fire? Because it may not be that the record you're looking for was even in the building when the fire occurred. So that takes knowledge about the area and it takes knowledge about the particular records that you're searching. So those are two things to be aware of when we're talking about the old courthouse burned story. Another one is, like, a lot of people have parts of their family history that are published in books, and we all know about these books. These books are on the shelves in libraries, and they're scanned and online. And a lot of people will look up their surname and they'll see, oh wow, here's my family history all the way back to 1600, and somebody wrote it in a book, so it's got to be true. Well, the real reality is that the family history books are just the early 20th century equivalent of the ancestry family trees. Their information is only as good as what the person who is compiling it was able to gather. So sometimes they got really great information back from family members by writing letters and visiting and all of that stuff. Other times they got no information back. So their information is just as good as what they were able to collect. So while it's very convenient to have a family history book and to be able to look people up in it, it's a great starting point. It's not the be all and the end all. So that's a really good way to look at it, is to look at it as a hint, like we look at our ancestry family trees as a hint. And conversely, all of the records I need to do my family history are online, or I can type my name into ancestry.com and get a complete family tree. Well, either one of these are dangerous, as we know. Probably for every record that's online, there's probably 20 or 30 other records that are not online and are buried somewhere at the local level in a courthouse or in a local library or historical society. So there is a vast collection of information for family history online, but it's by no means the whole collection. And then if you want to go and type your name into ancestry.com and see what you get for a family tree, you're more than welcome to do so. But I would not put a lot of stake into what's there. Again, it has to be verified and you have to do the research yourself in order for it to be of any credibility. So it is not one-stop shopping, unfortunately. DNA, yes, DNA is springing up other myths. People take these ethnicity estimates as gospel. Again, if you know anything about DNA, you know that these ethnicity estimates are not hard and fast. So if you're 38% Southern Italy today, you may be something else in a few months when the database updates. So all of these ethnicity estimates are very fluid. They're constantly changing. They're not ever going to be the same. They may be fundamentally similar. But the fact of the matter is that no one's ever going to be able to tell you the exact percentage of what you are as far as ethnicity goes. This is basically really very young science. It's science that's evolving and will continue to evolve through the years. So look at your ethnicity estimates as hints. Look at them as some clues. Look at them as fun, but they're not going to probably ever get to 100% accuracy. It's just not the nature of them. So how do we separate facts from some of these fictions that we've just looked at? So what we can do is, one, avoid confirmation bias, and this is a huge one. Confirmation bias is defined as a tendency to favor information that confirms our beliefs or hypothesis. So if we are looking into the story that we have Native American ancestors, sometimes we're going to find ourselves drawn toward information that may help confirm this belief. But if we want to do ourselves a favor when we're examining our family stories, we want to keep an open mind. We want to be able to be unbiased as we're looking at these records. And if the records pull us in a different direction than we expected to go, then we need to be open to that possibility. So to be aware that confirmation bias exists and that it's a thing in family history is probably the first step toward correcting it. I think all of us are very invested in our beliefs about our family. And so to have something come along that shatters those beliefs can be very difficult. It can be emotional. It can be something that we just can't deal with. But to be aware of it is definitely the first step. So be aware that confirmation bias exists when it comes to doing our family history research. A good way to overcome confirmation bias is to use the genealogical proof standard. And that's abbreviated GPS, and it is similar to GPS that we use in a car in that it points us in a direction to take. So it gives us step-by-step things that we can do to help avoid confirmation bias when we're researching. And basically the genealogical proof standard is to conduct reasonably exhaustive research, which means we want to find as many records as we possibly can to help confirm or refute our story. We want to cite our sources for those records so that we know exactly what we've looked at. We want to take all of those records together collectively and analyze the information in them. We want to resolve conflicts like, well, we know that Peter Moore was in Albany in 1920, so we know he can't be in Detroit in 1920. So that's a conflict we would have to resolve. And I do see a question here. Oh, thank you, Mindy. And then next we have present a coherent conclusion. So especially if you're dealing with family members who maybe believe these things, you want to be able to tell them, look, I've found proof that this is not true. And you have to be able to back that up with your research and your proof. So you've got to have some good, solid evidence to tell these people. Otherwise, they're probably just going to go on believing what they're believing. Okay, so second, figure out the source of the story. Now, remember we said at the beginning of this that a lot of our family stories are of unknown origin. If we try to figure out where the origin of the story is, this might help us to figure out whether the story's true or not. So we want to take advantage of the family gatherings that we have. We want to ask, maybe Aunt Mabel tells the same story every Thanksgiving. We want to ask her, where did she hear that story? Who did you hear that from? When was the earliest that you can remember hearing it? And where were you and who was telling the story? You can ask other family members in the family where they first heard the story, because they may have a different story than Aunt Mabel. They may tell you something differently. The other thing is to find maybe some more distant matches or DNA matches or distant relatives, other people who may have also heard the family story. You can find them through DNA matches or through their online family trees. So maybe you find a second or third cousin that you don't necessarily know, but is related to you through the same family line that Aunt Mabel's talking about. You can go and you can reach out to them and you can say, well, we've always had this story in our family. Do you know anything about it, or how have you ever heard it? That person may have either heard an entirely different version of the story, or not heard the story at all, or heard a completely different story. So it's always a good idea to take stock and take inventory to see if you can kind of figure out where the story originated, where it may have come from. And that may help you to make a determination about its reliability. You want to use the records out there to establish different facts about the story. Who does it involve? When did it happen? Where did it happen? When and where are going to be huge components about figuring out where these stories are and where you can fact check them. Some of these sources can be used to fact check things, especially when we're talking about things like crimes or, different places that people lived, or, illegitimate children or whatever. Any of these types of records could help us with information about those things. So we use birth certificates, we use newspapers. Newspapers in the old days tended to be fairly gossipy. So if your ancestor lived in a small town, you may be able to get some very interesting information from a newspaper article. Church registers, things like baptisms and burials and marriages, telephones and city directories, who's living in whose house. Census records also can establish who's living where. So all of those types of things will give you facts about particular people, where they were when, so that you can say if your ancestor went to the gold rush and he was living in Albany in 1850, well, then that was probably an awfully quick trip to California if you went out in 1849. So keep those things in mind about how you can check where people were when. So one story I wanted to tell as an example, I had a client that said to me, my Aunt Ellen was a dancer in the Ziegfeld Follies. And I thought, okay, well, that's a great story, really great story. So how can we prove or disprove that Aunt Ellen was a dancer in the Follies? So my first order of business was to establish when the Ziegfeld Follies actually happened. So they happened in the early 20th century, and they ran until 1931. So, okay, that gives me a time period. So I kind of roughly know when Ellen Scott was born. So then I looked up in 1907, Ellen Scott was married and had children already. So I'm thinking, well, I'm guessing that Ziegfeld dancers probably didn't tend to be married women. They were probably single women, and they were probably fairly young single women. In 1920, and the Ziegfeld Follies are still going on in 1920, Ellen was a widow and she was raising 5 children on her own. So it's probably very doubtful that she had time to be in the Ziegfeld Follies. She might have benefited from the salary being a Ziegfeld Follies dancer, but it really is unlikely that her circumstances would have allowed her to be a Follies dancer. So I don't believe that Ellen Scott was a dancer in the Ziegfeld Follies. So you can see how we've used records to establish where Ellen Scott was, how old she was, what her circumstances were, to kind of debunk the myth that she was a Ziegfeld Follies dancer. So we've used records to get to that point. One of the things you might want to do, and this is something that many people have done, is use your family story as an inspiration to you. You might use the family story as an inspiration to find out more, to document your family history, or maybe you want to tell the story about what you found out about your family story. There are lots of different alternatives in this day and age to do that. You can make a blog about your experience. You could make videos as you go and travel around to places where your ancestors may have lived. You could produce a podcast, or you could write a family history memoir. Lots of people have done just that. They have written family history memoirs that are maybe fictional books based on a family story or based on something that they were told as children. One of the examples that I like to talk about is the book Cane River. If you've never read the book Cane River, it's a fictionalized story that's based on a person's actual family history. So this woman went and did research on her family history, and she was able to gain some facts about her family, but then she made up a story to kind of fill in the gaps where the paper trail was not available. So she used her family stories as inspiration to create this book. The other thing is maybe you might want to try is to make a book of life like they do on Finding Your Roots. This can be inspired by the facts that you've discovered about your family, but can also incorporate some of the family stories. We can interview family members. We can have them tell their family stories. Those kinds of things would then be preserved for future generations. So not only do you have the family story, but you have it in a way it exists in this day and age. So you know that further down the line, you can say, okay, this was how the family story was being told in 2022. So you have an actual tangible proof of how the family story was being narrated at that time. The other thing you want to do is when you're working on figuring out the validity of your family story, you want to be prepared for some pushback by your family. Because a lot of people, like I said before, are very invested in these stories. These are things that they've been hearing all their life, and it might rub them the wrong way to feel that you have figured out that grandma was not exactly right when she was telling her story. So some family members may feel that this is an affront to grandma, and it's not really a very good thing to reflect on her. And, you're not meaning this personally. You're just meaning this because you want to find out whether the family story is true or not. But be prepared to see that some people are not going to accept what you have come up with. You're going to need accurate documentation to support your story. So that's something that you really want to make sure that you have. You also want to give them some time to accept what's going on. It may take them a while to say, okay, well, maybe you're right. Maybe grandma wasn't right about this. But you need to understand that they need to have a little bit of time to absorb this. So it's always good to just realize that the family story might not be going away. It might still be a good family story, but it might not be 100% accurate. Okay, so urban legend. Oh, yeah. So this is a little thing that I worked on for the Irish American Heritage Museum. This stone is in a cemetery in Greene County, New York, in Ashland, New York. And it's a fairly modern stone, as you can tell. It looks pretty modern. It was placed in the 1950s, and it was dedicated to the memory of 14 young Irish girls who were killed in a mill fire in rural Greene County. Now, there is no date on the stone of when this happened. There's no specific names. There's no name of where the fire occurred. There's absolutely nothing. So I was given the task of finding out something about this particular incident. And what ended up ultimately happening was we could find no proof that this ever happened. And it did not happen in Greene County that we can find proof of. Certainly, we figured if there was a fire that killed 14 people, this would have been fairly big news in the 19th century. There was no mention in any newspaper of this kind of tragedy. I reached out to a couple of museums for this type of industry. There was a mill museum in Connecticut that I reached out to. I reached out to the town historians in this area, reached out to the county historian. No one had heard of this particular incident. They were all kind of familiar with the stone, but they were not familiar with the incident and could find no proof. So just to put it in context of the presentation, stories not only happen in our families, but they also happen in our communities. And sometimes these stories cannot be proved or disproved, but they clearly mean enough to the community to be memorialized in this particular way. So there are stories that bring us together as communities. There are stories that bring us together as families, but these stories serve purposes beyond being true or not true. So that's just an example of urban legend that sometimes can spring up. All right. Who's got some questions? Anybody got any questions for me?
Well, people are maybe taking a moment to think of their questions. I'll just mention that Lisa will be back on March 14th for Tracing Irish Immigrants. And then we just discussed a little bit earlier that she's also planning on joining us April 11th and May 9th, but those topics are yet to be determined. So keep an eye on the library's calendar for those presentations as well.
Yes, and I'll get those going here. One of these days, I'll come up with something. And just a word about next month's presentation. It's going to be specifically about a couple of different types of records that are not as well known for discovering Irish ancestors. So if you have Irish ancestors in New York City or Boston, then you're going to find these records could be very helpful to you. So that's what it's going to be more specifically about. So it's about a couple of record sets that most people don't know a lot about. So should be good.
Great.
So if you have any questions that you think of later on, please just feel free to shoot me an email and I'll be glad to answer them for you. But hopefully you enjoyed today's presentation. And like I said, it was light. It wasn't real heavy, but just some food for thought today, some things for you to think about, and maybe go back and examine some of your family stories to see what you can find for fact or fiction.
It's very interesting. It's nice to have those in mind as you,
yes,
as you go about.
So you kind of put them in context, like, oh, okay, well, maybe everybody else thinks the same thing. So
right. Might want to look at that one a little bit more closely.
Right, exactly. Yes.
Okay, well, we will post this recording to our library's YouTube page once it's ready. And thanks everyone for joining us. And thank you, Lisa.
Thank you. And we'll see you next month.
See you next time. Bye-bye.